Well, it's interesting to look at what happens when I, for example, speak to professional audiences. I mean, I speak to thousands of people every month. And the most difficult audiences are the medical ones, who deal with the manifestations of early childhood loss, but they don't know that that's what they're dealing with. They think they're looking at diseases, symptoms, mental illness, dysfunctions, psychoses, behaviors that are categorized under one diagnosis or another. They don't realize that the commonality is the early childhood loss and trauma. I mean, you present them with that information, and you present it to them in detail with all the research parameters being covered, so that it's not just impressionistic or anecdotal, but actually research-based. They sit there stunned. They don't know what to do with it. And that's not my own, you know, if that was only my own failure to communicate, I could say, okay, well, if somebody else presented with them, maybe they would listen. But no, I'm told, like Dr. Bruce Perry, who's the head of the Houston Child Trauma Academy, leading research on childhood trauma and brain development, he tells me the same thing. And Dr. Vincent Felitti, who's the lead investigator of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies in California, showing again the exponential impact of childhood loss. The more losses accrue, the greater the risk of addiction, greater the risk of cancer, greater risk of autoimmune disease, mental illness, dysfunction, criminality, relationship problems, personality disorders, etc., etc., etc. He tells me the same thing. So when you address professional audience, particularly, who are intellectually trained, they sit there wrapped in their intellectual armor, and they literally are petrified by this material. And I've had that impression. Earlier this year, there was an article in Pediatrics, which is the leading pediatric journal in North America. It's the official publication of the American Academy of Pediatrics. There was an article from Harvard Center on the Developing Child, February of this year, collating all the material, showing how early childhood stress or trauma results in adaptations that help the child survive in the short term, but are the basis of pathology, physical illness, mental illness later on. And I presented this information to a group of pediatricians in a major Canadian city, at grand rounds at a hospital. I said, look, in your own journal, here it is. I don't have to sweat anymore to prove this to you. I've been saying this for a long time. But here it is. They sat there in stunned silence. It's not that they argued with me. Had they argued and engaged, pointed out where the data was flawed or whether the logic was somehow inadequate, that would have been fine. No, they just didn't know what to do with it. Now, what that tells me is that on the part of particularly professionals, there's a difficulty accepting this material because they haven't dealt with their own stuff. So the barrier, to come back to your question, the barrier is people's own unresolved stuff that they haven't dealt with themselves. And there was an interesting study about climate change denial recently. It turns out that the more educated you are, if you're denying climate change, the more educated you are, the more entrenched you are in your denial. So it's not that education leads to more openness. Education leads to less openness. Because what it does is that the intellectual weapons that you gain and sharpen in the course of your postgraduate education actually allows you to use your weapon and to marshal them in the service of your denial. But the denial comes first. So what I'm saying is that there's an emotional block. It's not an intellectual block. We don't need a stitch more research on what causes addiction. We don't need one more bit of research on what causes violence, rape, psychopathic behavior, mental illness. We don't need a stitch more research. I know that sounds like a radical statement in a society which is so research-oriented and where whole industries, intellectual industries, knowledge factories are based on having to gather more money for research to justify more jobs, to justify more papers. But I'm telling you, if we simply applied what we already know, if we simply drew the lessons of what's already been clearly shown, we would have a totally different world. So that even the very need for more research is a factor of denial. Whether from the States or England, I forget, they showed that childhood trauma may be a predisposing factor in addictions. More study is required. And I'm thinking, what planet are these people living on? Are they not familiar with the hundreds of studies that have shown a relationship between trauma and addiction? Do they not know the adverse childhood experiences studies? Are they not aware of the data on brain development and trauma? And what intellectual labyrinth have they been lost in for the last 50 years for them to come up with this study that says childhood trauma may be related to addictions? Maybe. And then more studies required. So what I'm saying is that the very need for research and intellectualization is actually a factor of denial. It represents denial. And that denial really is really about people's own emotional pain. So the block is that this stuff is painful. And therefore we dare not look at it in ourselves. And therefore we don't open to its existence in others. And then we have to look for all kinds of other reasons. If you deny pain owing to early experience and early loss and early trauma, then the world becomes very complicated and justify all kinds of complicated explanations. Yet if we see that a child has certain needs, and if you meet those needs, that child will be just fine. And if you don't, he'll have to adapt somehow. And those adaptations are the basis of dysfunction later on. That's really simple. They call it simplistic. It's not simplistic, it's simple. The world is really very simple. We make it complicated because of our denial. Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher who lives here in Vancouver, he talks about identification with form. And one of the things that we identify with is intellectual form, including thought. And when you identify with something, then you become that, and that becomes you. So therefore, when the thought is questioned, then you're being invalidated. Naturally, your response is going to be defensive. We have the evidence. It's just that the evidence is not incorporated. So when they talk about evidence-based practice, they're looking at a very specific kind of a very narrowly defined sense of evidence. If you actually look at the science, it's not that the science doesn't exist. We know how children's brains develop. We know how the chemistry of the brain develops. We know how behaviors occur as a response to either nurturing or impoverished environments, emotionally impoverished environments. We don't need more research. But again, it's this idea of identification that your question raises. If you make yourself, identification means to make yourself the same as. If you are the same as that, then when that is questioned, you're being questioned. And then, of course, it's a mortal question that you have to defend against. There's only one simple thing I've ever said in any of my books. You treat children well, they'll turn out okay. You don't treat them well, they don't turn out okay. Or at least they may not turn out so okay, and in fact they may have severely dysfunctional in their lives. That's it. That's all there's to it. All science comes down, all human science, psychology, behavioral science, psychiatry, educational philosophy, that's what it comes down to. Now, if you want to go to the library, it would take 1 million oxen to carry all the books that have been written on the subject. So yeah, all my books basically touch on the same theme, and they all arise with the same dynamic. Well, you know what it reminds me of always is the intellectual world is Jonathan Swift's satire of them in Gulliver's Travels, where these floating islands far away from the earth, where these intellectuals theorize and they debate abstruse ideas, but completely without any relationship to the earth, totally ungrounded, in other words. That's what we foster in our society. And of course, it's not just a factor of emotional denial, of course. It also serves a social need. Because if you're going to construct or live in a society or invested in a society that fundamentally objectifies people, and people become either producers or commodity consumers, then you have to actually ignore their fundamental emotional and spiritual needs. Because if people had fundamental emotional and spiritual needs, you would not treat them the way this society treats people. You would not make them work for low wages at a Walmart. You would not sell them products they don't need, let alone don't need, actually makes them sick. We live in a society that's pathological. Eric Fromm talked about the pathology of normalcy in his society. So the ideological blinders that keep us from looking at the really simple realities of human interaction and relationship doesn't just have to do with emotional denial. That emotional denial also serves a broad political and economic perspective, which means that the mainstream culture will focus on diversions rather than on genuine investigations, because the genuine investigations actually threaten the very basis of the society. So there's a political context to all this. My son and I were watching a football game last night, and they're the analysts go into great detail about the rationale behind each play and how the defense lines up, and really deep analysis of utterly meaningless activities. They're playing a game. And my son was saying that analysis itself is a substitute for real meaning, because people do have a need to understand things. People do have a need to see the larger picture. So then we restrict that need of theirs to totally a meaningless activity. In a sense, that's meeting a genuine human need for engagement and for comprehension and for in-depth understanding. So it's a genuine human need that's being met there, but utterly diverted into something that's not going to make a difference. What is that fanatical loyalty to a team? An identification with everybody else who also supports that team, and all the importance that we place on that's people's deep need to belong. Now, it's illusory, but in a society that doesn't provide a real true sense of belonging, people go for the simulacrum of it. So that's why, that loyalty and that the importance and belonging and supporting a team. And it's all about, there was an article in New York Times this weekend about a woman, I think it was in Nebraska, whose family had been involved in Nebraska sports for generations, and football is big at that university. And then she's raped by a football player, and the utter denial of it, and the disillusionment for the family. So the father never wants to her father never wants to set foot again on the Nebraska campus. The betrayal. So much of his existence had been identified with him being a Nebraska graduate and a supporter of their football program. Now that's totally illusory. But there's a deep need to belong, a deep need to be loyal, and a sense of betrayal when that loyalty is somehow insulted. If you didn't get the love that you needed, you'll be consumed by being liked, and then you'll be very likable and very nice. And you might become a helpful, very helping individual. Which is a coping pattern. Now, you can be genuinely nice and genuinely supportive of others and still look after your own needs. That's human nature, I think. But a lot of people are very nice and likable and helpful by suppressing their own needs. That's a coping mechanism. Everybody says how nice they are. And when they die at age 50 of cancer, everybody shows up at their funeral and they weep about how nice they were, how selfless they were. I saw the biography, the Martin Scorsese biography of George Harrison the other night. And Harrison was one of these people. Ringo Starr was visiting Harrison a couple of weeks before Harrison's death in Switzerland of brain tumor from lung cancer that had spread to his brain. Starr's own daughter had a brain tumor and was in Boston for an operation, and Starr was having to leave Switzerland visiting his dying friend and go to be with his daughter. And Harrison, who can barely get out of bed at this point, says, "Shall I come with you?" And Ringo Starr, when he says this, he starts weeping at how nice and how helpful and compassionate Harrison was, which he was, but at whose expense? And these are the people that end up with cancer. Now that's a coping mechanism. It meant that your childhood was such where your needs weren't met and you had to pay more attention to the needs of the parents. And that's how you cope. That's how you maintain the relationship with them. The day I read Harrison's biography some years ago, the day he got married, he reassured his mother that, "Mom, don't worry, I'll still be visiting you." Like apologizing really for getting married. Now that tells me everything about what happened in their childhood, his childhood. And of course he was known as the quiet Beatle, who didn't assert himself, who didn't speak out. And on their early albums, he was a great songwriter, but you wouldn't know that from their early albums because Lennon and McCartney were more dominant and he was the quiet one. So that self-suppression, that quietness, is actually a coping mechanism. The question really is, how compulsive is the niceness? In other words, will you compulsively and automatically suppress your needs to look after others? Or will you be conscious about it? Will you be doing it as a free choice? Or are you obsessively that way? It's not the external behavior that distinguishes the one from the other, it's the internal relationship to it. The people are compulsively that way. They deny their own needs, and of course this is when their body says no to them in the form of some kind of illness. So, whereas, I think that compassion is just true human nature. Again, one of the myths of our society is that people are competitive, aggressive, individualistic, dog eat dog. This is the law, the survival of the fittest, a complete misunderstanding of Darwinian evolutionary theory. In fact, the bending of evolutionary theory to basically justify capitalist murderous competition. That's not what people are. I think people are we're wired for compassion. Even rats are wired for compassion. You do studies on rats. A rat which is shocked with electricity will have an elevation of their stress hormones. But a rat that watches another rat being shocked has a higher stress hormone response than when they're stressed themselves. And other rat experiments have shown the same thing. Even rats are wired for altruism, not because there's an altruistic thought there, but simply because we're mammalian creatures who depend upon interaction and mutual support. The child basically has two needs. We have the need for attachment, which is the seeking of closeness and proximity with another human being, and fundamentally, the attachment dynamic is the most powerful dynamic in human life. And its basic purpose is the protection and nurturing of the young, so that infants attach to their parents and parents attach to infants for the purpose of, on the one hand, of being taken care of, and on the other, of taken care of. So that's attachment, and we're wired for attachment all our lives. It's the most important dynamic we have, and as Gentleman Petraeus could tell you, that we're wired for attachment, and sometimes when our attachment needs get sent in certain directions, it'll trump everything else. That's one need that we have, is for attachment. Without attachment, there's no human life. It's just impossible. And without mating, without communities, we would not have survived as a species either. As rugged individualists, we would not have got off the first evolutionary base, let alone, come to where we are right now. So it's, the whole idea of human beings as competitive and aggressive is total nonsense. But the other need that we have is for authenticity, to be ourselves. And that again has to do with survival. If you're not in touch with yourself, out in the wild, you don't survive. So authenticity is being in touch with yourself and being able to act on your awareness of self in relationship to the environment. I mean, that's just authenticity. So if I feel something, I pay attention to that. If I don't, I'm in danger. So we have this need for authenticity. But if a child is confronted with a dilemma, that if I'm authentic, express my feelings, then my attachments are threatened because my parents can't handle it, because they're too stressed, depressed, or traumatized themselves, then perforce the child will not automatically, I should say, will automatically but not consciously suppress their authenticity. And so that the suppression of gut feelings and authenticity is a coping mechanism. That means I'm no longer in touch with my needs. I no longer pay attention to my feelings, my emotions. I will no longer be aware of them. I won't express them. I won't know what I need, which is all kinds of implications. But one of them is that I'll be compulsively then, I may then compulsively serve the needs of others, ignoring my own, hence disease. Or I may then develop all kinds of false needs, which then really are what addictions are all about. Now, so that it's that irresolvable tension between authenticity and attachment that many children in our society are faced with, that results in their self-suppression. And one of the outcomes, not the only possible outcome, but one possible outcome is then that niceness is a coping mechanism. Almost anybody, when they're being inauthentic, has a sense of them being inauthentic. How do we know that we're being inauthentic? Like years before I had any of these concepts formally worked out in my mind or had read much about it, but I already knew when I was betraying myself and being less than myself and being other than myself. How did I know that? There's some inner knowledge for many of us, simply because the authentic self, not that it disappears, and then when we're not in touch with it, there's a kind of a shame, there's a kind of a suffering that happens. So that shame and that internal suffering, that sense of self-betrayal is our sure guide that we're not being ourselves. On one level, that happens to a lot of people. And then we may look good in the eyes of others, and yet internally we suffer shame because we know that we're not being ourselves. When we say, how do we know? Well, that for many of us is an internal knowledge that arises. Now, why? Because that essential self hasn't gone away and is calling to us. And we don't feel right when we betray it or when we're not out of contact with it. Now, that doesn't happen for many people. That doesn't happen for everybody. For some people, then, it takes some catastrophe. And I've had people with serious illnesses, cancer even terminal cancer. I mean, for 7 years I worked with terminally ill people in palliative care. I've had even people with terminally devastating conditions tell me that this disease is the best thing that ever happened to me. Now, I don't recommend it to anybody, nor am I saying people should feel that way about it. I'm just saying that that was my experience, that people will say such things. Why? Because the onset of the illness and confronting its implications for the first time put them in touch with their real self. So what I'm saying is that at some point or another, if you're not in touch with that inner voice, if you don't hear it, the body will speak to you loud and clear. You're going to get something happen to you. And sometimes that'll happen in the form of illness or symptoms. Then the body's talking to you. The body's saying no when you're not saying no. Hence the title of my book, When the Body Says No. So then, that's the second way. If the voice doesn't speak to you directly, or if it speaks to you and you don't listen, your body at some point is going to kick in. Or you're going to get depressed, or anxious, or something else. Or something will happen in your personal relationships. And at that point, you can say, well, I'm not with the right partner. Screw them, it's all their fault, which many of us say. Or, for some people, it becomes the opening of a door where we begin to look, okay, what in here wasn't authentic? What in here wasn't genuine? How did I create this situation? How do I keep creating these situations over and over again? Am I just a victim of bad luck? Or is there some pattern here? In other words, something happens, some difficulty happens to shake you out of your complacent belief that things are just fine the way they are. And as the California-based great teacher A.H. Alma says, that the most difficult things that happen to us are also the most compassionate things, because basically they're ways of a part of it, how he puts it, a part of us that loves us more than anything else, puts these roadblocks in our way, saying, that's not the way, that's not the way, that's not the way, you better not go that, so there's roadblocks in the way to bring us to ourselves, and so we can look upon our difficulties as problems to get rid of, or we can look at them as teachings to bring us back to ourselves. When somebody asks a question, they may not know the answer, but as soon as you ask the question, and asking a question simply means, why do I have cancer? Or why do I have depression? Or why am I addicted? Or I just don't feel right. What's wrong? I mean, as soon as somebody asks that question, they are already on the path. Now, people that don't even ask that original question, you really can't help. I don't see them as a professional. Why would I? They don't come to me. Or in the medical office, sometimes they come with a symptom, and if I suggest that, okay, well, let's deal with your symptom, but let's also open a broader inquiry as to what this may represent about your life. Look at asthma, for example. Asthma, narrowing of the airways, inflammation of the airways. We treat it with adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline and cortisol are the stress hormones. The studies are totally clear on the relationship between asthma and stress. The more stressed the parents are, the more likely the children are to have asthma. The woman I called Mary in the book is a native Canadian woman, First Nations, what they call Indian in the States, who dies of scleroderma, which is an autoimmune condition. And it was actually in considering her illness and what I learned about her and how she had this lifelong self-denial, where really she turned against herself until her immune system turned against her too. That's when I first began to consider that perspective. Excuse me. And when I first began to look at the medical and the scientific research on a relationship between emotional repression and childhood trauma and autoimmune illness or illness in general. She also happened to be the subject of the very first newspaper column I wrote. I used to write a weekly medical column for a Canadian newspaper, and she was the first case example. So she was seminal in my intellectual evolution, you might say. And she was also a prime example of somebody who's very sweet, giving, loving, wonderful person who was completely incapable of saying no and of looking after her own needs, because she had never been given enough space to do that. Her adaptation, given her childhood history, was to always be serving and looking after others and ignoring herself. So she was, in a sense, the template for all the other stories that I gathered, because when you get down to it, all illness, it doesn't matter who I spoke to, similar patterns, whether it's ALS, multiple sclerosis, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic fatigue. A study this week, chronic fatigue may be related to childhood trauma. Well, maybe, for God's sakes, there's not a case of it that isn't, but they keep coming out, they keep reinventing the wheel. Anyway, it was with Mary that I first saw that. So she was both a poignant example of it and the first example that I really considered. The Western medical model, and I don't mean the science of it, I mean the practice of it, because the science is completely at odds with the practice. The practice of it makes two devastating separations. First of all, we separate the mind from the body. We separate the emotions from the physiology. So we don't see how the physiology of people reflects their lifelong emotional experience. So we separate the mind from the body, which is not something that traditional medicine has done. I mean, Ayurvedic or Chinese medicine or shamanic tribal cultures, medicinal practices throughout the world have always recognized that mind and body are inseparable. They intuitively knew it. Many Western practitioners have known this, have even taught it, but in practice we ignore it. And then we separate the individual from the environment. So the studies are clear, for example, that when people are emotionally isolated, they tend to get sick more quickly and they succumb more rapidly to their disease. Why? Because people's physiology is completely related to their psychological social environment. And when people are isolated and alone, their stress levels are much higher because there's nothing there to help them modulate their stress. And physiologically, it's straightforward. You know, it takes a 5-year-old kid to understand it. However, because in practice we separate them, when somebody shows up with an inflamed joint, all we do is we give them an anti-inflammatory. Or, because the immune system is hyperactive and is attacking them, we give them a medication to suppress the immune system. Or we give them a stress hormone, like cortisol or one of its analogs, to suppress the inflammation. But we never ask, what does this manifest about your life? What does it say about your relationships? How stressful is your job? To what extent do you lack control in your life? Where are you not authentic? How are you trying to work so hard to meet your attachment needs by suppressing yourself? Because that's what you learned to do as a kid. Then we will do all this research that has to do with cell biology. So we keep looking for the cause of cancer in the cell. Now, there's a wonderful quote in the New York Times. A couple of years ago, they did a series on cancer, and somebody said, looking for the cause of cancer inside the individual cell is like trying to understand a traffic jam by studying the internal combustion engine. We'll never understand it, but we spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year looking at the cause of cancer inside the cell, not recognizing that the cell exists in interaction with the environment, and that the genes are modulated by the environment. They're turned on and off by the environment. So the impact of not understanding the unity of emotions and physiology, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the relationship between the individual and the environment, in other words, having a strictly biological model as opposed to what has been called a biopsychosocial model that recognizes that the biology is important, but it also reflects our psychological and social relationships, and therefore trying to understand the biology in isolation from the psychological and social environment is futile. The result is that we're treating people purely through pharmaceuticals or physical interventions, greatly to the profit of companies that manufacture pharmaceuticals and which fund the research, but it leaves us very much in the dark about A, the causes, and B, the treatment, the holistic treatment of most conditions. And so that for all our amazing interventions and technological marvels, we're still far short of doing what we could do. Were we mindful of that unity? So the consequences are devastating. Economically, they're devastating. Emotionally, they're devastating. Medically, I was in Massachusetts last year, speaking there, and I was told that at the local HMOs, the health maintenance organizations, GPs get 6 minutes a patient, 10 patients an hour, and the psychiatrist gets 10 minutes. Now, what can you do in 10 minutes? If somebody comes to me with a rash, by the way, what do we call a rash? We call it an eruption. What else erupts? Well, anger erupts. guess what? Rashes often have to do with the suppression of anger. So that's how it erupts, in the form of a skin rash. It takes me a minute to prescribe a cortisol cream, the stress hormone cream, which will suppress the inflammation. But for them to be talking about their lives, no, that would take some time. When the HMO tells me I got 6 minutes a patient, and if I'm a psychiatrist, I get a whole 10 minutes, what can I do besides prescribe a medication? You know, so there's that. But the basic limitation is not a financial one. It's also an ideological one, and it has to do with those blinders we talked about earlier. The fact that physicians are not trained that way. They get their own unresolved stuff. They don't know how to relate to this information. Yes, the whole system is devastatingly stupid and blind. Now, there are pockets of light. It's in Massachusetts also, for example, that John Kabat-Zinn has worked on the mindfulness-based stress reduction. They've applied this to medical conditions, always with benefit, never with harm. You know, the model, I don't think it goes deep enough. They don't deal with all this emotional stuff that I think is important to pay attention to, but just mindfulness-based stress reduction itself is a great step forward, and, you know, more credit to them. But yeah, to apply those models universally would take a complete overhaul of, you say the medical system. We don't have a medical system. We have a non-system. We have a patchwork of competing interests and hospitals and institutions and pharmaceuticals and schools of thought and invested interests and genuinely committed people working in very narrow ways. But there's no system. The system is a non-system. Screening for breast cancer, screening for prostate cancer. Now the studies are becoming increasingly clear that everything we've been telling people is useless. Breast self-examinations, guess what? They don't save lives. Mammograms, guess what? They don't save lives. Now this has been clear to some of us for years, because we looked at the research. But now it's being publicly admitted. Is that making a bit of a difference? No, because people have to believe that what they've been doing all these years is useful. Number one. Number two, if you've been in, if your living depends on screening mammograms or on prostate cancer tests and treatments, you're going to have a hard time accepting the evidence. So there's a kind of a vested interest that way, but for the most part, the denial and the disorganization in the system is not, I don't think, cupid. It's not based on cupidity. It's not based on economic self-interest. I think it's based more on these broader emotional and ideological factors.
This inability to see, I mean, basically
yeah.
the blinders.
The blinders, yeah. Yeah, I don't think a doctor says, this would cost me money, therefore I won't look at it. There may be doctors like that, but I don't think that's what drives it. I think what drives it is more the blinders, which fit hand in glove, of course, with the economic self-interest as well. If somebody came to me with a physical symptom or illness, as a physician, I would first help them with that. And secondly, I would gently suggest that we open an inquiry as to the meaning of that symptom or illness in their lives and how that relates to their lifelong patterns and their relationships to themselves and to others and to society. And then I might say, I may or may not be trained myself to help you with that stuff, but if you're willing to open up that inquiry, here's so-and-so that you could speak to. Here's such and such that you could read. But, you know, are you open to inquire? Are you open to looking at that question? Now, I've had people tell me that reading this or that of my books has made a huge difference in their lives. Why? Because they got a different sense of how to relate to themselves. So I know that can be helpful on the physical and on the emotional level. So in other words, whether a child comes in with ADD or whether an adult comes in with a physical illness, whatever the presenting manifestation is, I wouldn't see that as the problem. we would see that as the manifestations of a deeper problem, which is not that we ignore what they came in with, but nor do we stop, though, at simply trying to get rid of what they came in with. So it's not just a question of getting rid of the inflammation, of the rash, of the depression, suppressing the symptoms of the ADD, but also of opening up that conversation about what does this mean about how this family is living their lives, how that's manifested in the child's dysfunction, so that how can we help the child by looking at the whole family dynamic? How can it help you by looking at your relationships to your life, to yourself, to others in your life? So again, it's not, conceptually it's very straightforward. Now, you know, there are all kinds of practical necessities to work it out and how to, you know, fit this into a system. But the first question is just to, the first issue is just to ask the question. I had this naive idea after my book on ADD came out, scattered in the States, scattered mind. People say, wow, we finally get it. But in the ADD world, they don't want to touch it. They don't want, now the book's a bestseller in Canada and it's doing very well in the States, but no thanks to the official organizations that deal with ADD, they don't even want to hear it because they think I'm blaming the parent. They want to believe that it's a genetic disease. Because if it's a genetic disease, then we don't have to look at anything. We can just medicate. ADD is another coping mechanism. To go back to that Harvard study I mentioned earlier, and they're reported in pediatrics, children's response to early stress, adaptive responses that help them survive the stress, later become sources of pathology. Now, when I was diagnosed with ADD myself at age 54, it was really helpful to me because I understood a lot of things about myself. At least I thought I understood. At least I saw described about myself in a pattern that I hadn't ever considered in any way represented some kind of a dynamic in me. So it was very helpful to me to be diagnosed and to be self-diagnosed primarily and then have that confirmed. But from the beginning, I didn't buy into the idea that it was a genetic disease. Not for a second. Because tuning out, which is the hallmark of ADD, the absent-mindedness, is not a disease. It's actually a coping mechanism. It's one of the brain's coping mechanisms. When the stress is too much, and we can't fight back, escape, or ask for help, then one of the ways the brain deals with it is to tune it out. It's a form of disassociation. It's a form of dissociation. It's or what has been called divided attention. So that's a coping mechanism, and that was clear to me. So when you look at a condition like ADD, the diagnosis of which is just going up leaps and bounds every few years, when the number of prescriptions are going up. In the States, there are 3 million kids on stimulant medications, 500,000 on antipsychotic medications, many of them for ADHD, not because they're psychotic, but because their impulse control is so poor, and we're so bereft of understanding child development that we have to sedate them instead of helping them. When you get these numbers going up all the time, it can't be genetic because genes don't change in a population over a few years. Nor is it just that we're recognizing it more. Really, it's that we have more and more kids who are just lacking impulse control and lacking the capacity to pay attention. Well, why? Well, if we understand that tuning out, divided attention, disassociation is a coping mechanism, then the question we have to ask is, what's stressing these kids so much that they have to respond that way? And if we ask that question, we can no longer look at DNA. Now we have to look at what's happening in those kids' lives. Well, their parents are more stressed. The village, the clan, the neighborhood, the tribe, that safe holding environment where children had many nurturing adults to relate to, uncles and aunts, is gone. The parents themselves have less support, and both parents are having to work, so parents don't even see the kids the whole day. So kids are very stressed. And of course kids, especially if they're very sensitive, they absorb their parents' stresses, like I did as a Jewish infant in the ghetto of Budapest under Nazi occupation in Hungary in 1944. How does an infant deal with that stress? Can't fight back, can't ask for help, can't run away, You tune it out. But when are you tuning it out? You're tuning out when the brain is developing. So there's this astonishing brain developmental data that's not even vaguely controversial, that has been fully established now in the last few decades, that the brain develops under the impact of the environment. When the environment is stressed, then the tuning out, which is a coping mechanism, goes from a temporary state, becomes wired into the brain as a long-term trait. So we go from state to a trait. Now we have 8 years later, or 54 years later, a person who's diagnosed with ADD. Why? Because their initial environment was so stressed, not because the parents didn't love them, it's not a question of blaming anybody, not because the parents didn't do their best, but because they themselves were so stressed that the child dealt with the stress in the environment by tuning out when their brain was developing. And furthermore, when the dopamine circuits, dopamine being the incentive, motivation, attention chemical, which we supplement with Ritalin or dexedrine later on, if we diagnose these people, those dopamine circuits don't develop well when the environment is totally stressed. So it's a perfect storm that we're creating in our society by stressing parents, by cutting asunder the ties of culture, tribe, clan, village, extended family, so neither children or parents have that supportive context. And no wonder you're going to have more kids with troubled brains. It's very simple, both psychodynamically in terms of the need to tune out, and then in terms of the brain development. And then along comes the pharmaceutical industry and says, here's what we can do. We can suppress the symptoms by increasing dopamine levels, by giving these kids these medications, which may or may not be okay in individual cases, but it does nothing for brain development. It does nothing for the child's psychological growth. Nothing. It simply is a suppressing of a symptom. Conceptually, it's obvious. Scientifically, it's the only reasonable case to be made, and yet people are invested in not seeing it. And yet I find that I get a lot of emails and a lot of people I meet, parents who are just so thankful for having been given that perspective, that if they work on their attachment relationship with the child, if they're attuned to their children, if they pay attention to their children in a way that the child needs, that the child's symptoms can abate and the children can undergo tremendous growth. So people are actually open to it. Now, some people are not. Some people are just not ready to look at themselves, so they just want the child medicated. But a lot of parents are actually, as a parent, how would most people rather see their kids as being genetically flawed and doomed to this condition for all their lives? Or would they rather understand that the child's brain condition is a response to early stress that the parents unwittingly passed on to their child, but which can be mitigated and new development can still overcome it, or in many ways alleviate it, if we do not provide the right conditions? As a parent, which message would you rather hear? That there's something you can do, or your kid is genetically doomed, here's a pill? And which would you rather hear? And naturally, many people would rather hear the message that, yeah, our stress has contributed to this, we couldn't help it, we did our best, but now that we understand it, we can actually do something differently. And I find that both teachers and parents are very open to the message when they hear it. It's only that they don't hear it from too many people. In the ADD world, of all the books out there, mine is the only one that ever goes to the model of brain development and stress. Any parent who's got a child with any problems at all already feels a tremendous sense of responsibility and self-blame. So for some people then to hear that actually, you know what, yes, it was your stresses that did play a huge role in the development of your child's problems, is devastating. So they'd rather hear that it's genetic. So the genetic theory is very comforting to a lot of people. Because they don't understand, they don't hear the part that it wasn't their fault. Because they actually did their best. And what they were acting out themselves as parents is the stuff that happened to them as kids. Nor are we blaming their parents, because what was true for them is also true for their parents. So we're talking about multi-generational, transpersonal, and culturally imposed stress and trauma. And there's no individual to blame. So there's those studies where you can look at the child strange situation, where at 1 year of age you submit a child to the presence of a stranger in the absence of the parent, and the parent comes back in, and whether the child can be soothed by the parent or whether the child remains anxious or disconnected from the parent. And how the child responds tells us everything about the ability of that parent to have connected with the child emotionally, attuned to the child in the child's first year of life. And that strange situation, how the child responds at 1 year to the same situation, will predict very often how well they do in school or in life a decade later or decades later. And then you can do the adult attachment into you that tells us about a parent's or an adult's relationship to the attachment figures in their lives when they were children. And then you have this amazing correlation where you can do an adult attachment into you on somebody who's not even a parent yet, and how they respond on the parent, on the adult attachment into you will predict how their unconceived child will years later respond in the strange situation at 1 year of age. Then we can see how impersonal these factors are, non-personal they are. They affect persons, but they're not personal. They're transgenerational, transpersonal, transmitted patterns. And when you understand that, there's nobody left to blame. But again, in a society that always looks to blame people, that when there's something wrong, we're always looking for somebody to blame. Rather than looking at causes, we're looking at who's the enemy, who's at fault, which is, our approach to foreign policy and everything else in this life. Then when you point out the early environment, people right away perceive that the parents are being blamed. So I've literally had reviewers who've supposedly have read my book, where I talk about very deliberately and as articulately as I can generate about the inappropriateness of blaming parents, about the unscientific invalidity of blaming parents, and they'll flat out and say, he blames parents. That's all they can perceive, because they haven't dealt with their own shame and responsibility, so they think that I'm pointing a finger at them. They're just pointing a finger at themselves. But and they don't realize that their attachment to genetic theory is just their way of fending off their self-blame. That actually, on the contrary, I'm saying to them, look, you're not at fault. You did your best. It's not your fault. It's not personal to you. Now, that takes a bit of sophistication. In that sense, the genetic theories are very simple, and therefore they are a relief to a lot of people. They're a relief, and they also leave us at a dead end. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh talks about how we inter-are. We don't only are, we also inter-are. So who we are reflects our psychological, social relationships, our cultural relationships. That interbeing, as he calls it, does expand our identity. But in a society that restricts people to the ego, and then either lauds or blames the manifestations of ego, either rewards them with power and wealth, or shames them if they don't function well, and where we deny the interconnection of things, or as what the Buddha talked about, the interdependent co-arising of phenomena, that nothing arises on its own. I mean, it's so true in psychology, physiology, ecology, history, whatever you care to look at. But if we don't look at it, then we're left with the individual. And then the individual is left off trying to fend off blame. So again, it does take an expansion on identity, but a very liberating expansion on identity. Now, as a parent, I know how I pass my stuff on to my kids. And it's not easy to deal with that. It's not easy to deal with knowing that had I led my life differently, my children as adults would not be carrying the burdens that they're carrying. That's only a fact. And I also know that even intellectually recognizing it doesn't absolve us from the internal shame or self-blame around it. That's other work entirely. So I understand why people have difficulty going there. But it's just the truth. Stress is a response to a threat, either to life or to the loss of something that the organism considers important. So the stress response is an essential coping mechanism, as always. It begins with an emotional event in the brain, such as fear, which then is communicated to the hypothalamus, which is the brain's master gland. It's also at the apex of the body's autonomic nervous system, which is the survival nervous system, which is not under our conscious control, so it's autonomous. It's called the autonomous or autonomic nervous system. So the hypothalamus then sets off a bunch of responses that ends up with the release of cortisol and adrenaline from an adrenal gland. Renal means kidney, adrenal, top of the kidney. The adrenal gland puts out two hormones. One is named after it, called adrenaline, and the other is, the adrenal gland has a cortex, like the brain does. Cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. So the cortex puts out another hormone named after it, called cortisol. So we have adrenaline and cortisol. These are the stress hormones. They increase our heart rate, our high blood pressure, tighten our muscles. Blood flow is distributed from the intestines to the muscles, so we have more oxygen to escape or to fight. This is cortisol elevates our blood sugar levels so that we have more energy, and it suppresses the inflammation that might be caused by stress. So far, so good. That's just a necessary response to a threat. However,
now, real or imagined? That was another thing.
Any perception of a threat. So any perception of a threat. So whether you're coming in with a knife, or whether I imagine that you have a knife in your pocket that you're about to wield in order to hurt or kill me, I'm going to be just as stressed by it. So the stress response is to either a threat or the perception of a threat. And of course that means that when people are threatened a lot early in their lives, they'll tend to perceive threat even when there isn't any. So they'll tend to be more stressed. There's another possibility, which is that because you've had to habituate to stress or to threat, you will not perceive it when it's there. So you'll end up in abusive relationships. So, these are both coping mechanisms. They're just different ways of coping to the same experience. So acute stress then is the response to the perception of a threat, real or imagined. The more we are out of touch with ourselves, the less we'll see the threat when it's there, or the more we'll imagine it to be there when it's not there. At the end of which continuum is the paranoid schizophrenic. Now, in the short term then, stress is an adaptive response to threat or its perception. Chronic stress though, those same stress hormones that help you survive in the short term, in the long term, devastate your body. Now, high blood pressure is a condition that doctors call idiopathic or essential hypertension. When there's no single disease that causes, you can have kidney disease causing high blood pressure, that's called secondary hypertension. But essential hypertension, the medical term for high blood pressure, is when we don't know the cause. We don't know the cause because we're not listening to ourselves. The word says hypertension. People with hypertension have too much tension in their lives. So their adrenaline levels are too high and their blood pressure goes up. So what I'm saying is that the adaptive response in the short term over the long term can damage the body by, for example, causing high blood pressure, by causing abnormalities of the heart rhythm, by causing too much tension in your muscles, by fatiguing you, so you get, guess what? Chronic fatigue. Cortisol in the short term gives you more sugar, suppresses inflammation, but in the long term causes ulcerations of the intestines, hypertrophy of your adrenal glands, suppression of your immune system, redistribution of body fat in a way that promotes heart disease. It can cause depression, thinning of the bones, osteoporosis. So women who are more stressed will have more likelihood of osteoporosis. Not that anybody ever talks about that. We only talk about the physical factors such as smoking, vitamin D, sunshine, calcium, all important stuff, but we don't talk about stress, which is probably the major factor. And in other words, the short-term stress is an adaptive response. The long-term stress undermines health. So when people when people's stress responses are out of whack, when they've been too stressed early, so they expect threat when it isn't there, when they overreact to stress, whether minor or major, when they walk into situations when they're stressed but they're not able to recognize the stress because they're so used to it that they think it's normal, when they develop mechanisms of coping where they suppress themselves, they suppress their gut feelings so that they don't defend themselves, they don't express who they are, what their needs are, what their emotions are. All of these things undermine the body's physiology. What else do we expect it to happen? And if I gave somebody, for some long-term condition, prednisone, which is a steroid, an analog of cortisol, I'd have to tell them, look, this can cause ulcerations of your intestines, this can thin your bones, this can make you depressed, this might potentially lead to heart disease, this might suppress your immune system. I'd have to tell them that. Well, whether we get the extra steroid through a medication, and again, we're using the stress hormone to control a lot of diseases, or whether that extra steroid load is generated internally in response to ongoing stress, the physical effects are equally devastating, or potentially. So the link between chronic stress and chronic illness is absolutely straightforward. And again, you have to consider the intrapersonal aspect. Because if you're stressed, but somebody who is attuned with you and you trust and has some compassion and insight says, hey Michael, how are you feeling? Do you want to talk about it? Your stress level goes down immediately. But if you're isolated, then you're stewing on your own stress juices for months upon months upon months. No wonder the isolated people are more likely to fall ill, which means that cancer, autoimmune disease are not individual diseases. They're manifestations of your relationship to your psychological and social environment, mediated through stress that is either alleviated by social contact or is exacerbated by isolation. The work on the physiology of stress was done here in Canada by a physician who, like me, is from Hungary. His name was Hans Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, Hungarian name János Selye. He's the one that did the work in the laboratory that showed that stressed animals will have hypertrophied adrenal glands, suppressed immune systems, and ulcerations in their intestines. He's also the one that coined the word stress the way we use it today. So the word stress was coined here in Canada in the sense of his meaning today. And he pointed out that people become addicted to their own stress hormones. So these are the so-called adrenaline junkies. When you're used to it from early childhood on, that's the state that you're in, then when you're not in that stress state, you're bored and you're restless and you don't know what to do with yourself. So you generate stress just to feel normal. What to you occurs as normal. So people can become actually physiologically addicted to their own stress hormones, and when they don't feel the flow of adrenaline, they go through withdrawal like any addict. They feel irritable, depressed, fatigued, and so on. So in order not to feel that way, they generate more stress. That's the second dynamic. The third dynamic is that when stress feels normal to you, you no longer experience it as stress, so that you keep putting yourself in situations without knowing how stressed you are, because you're out of touch with your body. So there's any number of ways in which stress becomes habituated into the body and the brain and your psychodynamics. But then that means that you're continually exposed to it, and then at some point your body's going to say no. Well, if you look at the hormonally related cancers, which by the way many of them are, like say testicular cancer, or prostate cancer in men, or breast cancer in women, a number of things emerge. One is, of course, that the medical profession treats them totally as biological events. I mean, narrowly biological events. There was a study in Toronto where they looked at women who had survived breast cancer, and they asked them, what is it that they think had caused the cancer and what helped them survive it? And more women put down stress than any other factor. Now, the researchers, being medical doctors, said this just shows you how out of touch everybody is. People blame stress for everything. In fact, there's no evidence that stress has anything to do with breast cancer. We know that there's a lot of evidence linking hormones on breast cancer, maybe some evidence leading certainly genetics, and maybe some evidence linking diet to breast cancer, but not stress. Well, guess who was right? The medical doctors were dead wrong. The women were totally right. First of all, genetics. Out of 100 women with breast cancer, 7 will have the breast cancer gene. 93 do not. Out of 100 women with the breast cancer gene, not all of them will get cancer. Their risk certainly goes up, but there's no one-to-one relationship between having the gene and having the cancer. And most women with breast cancer have no identified genes. Number one. When it comes to diet, there's a very weak relationship. I won't deny it, but it's statistically not all that significant. Hormonally, yes. Some breast cancers are obviously driven by estrogen, for example. So we give a medication to suppress or to block their estrogen receptors so that the estrogen no longer drives the growth of the cancer. But where the argument breaks down is when you look at the relationship between stress and hormones. Hormones have everything to do with stress. Whether in men or women, you can predictably interfere with their healthy hormonal balance by imposing emotional stresses on them. The loss of a football game will reduce the testosterone levels of the fans, or the loss of a soccer game. Nobody ever touched them physically, but if you measure their testosterone levels before and after the game, the losing team's fans will have diminished testosterone levels. Now, if you look at the person in female monkeys in captivity, if you look at female hormone levels like estrogen, progesterone, follicle-stimulating hormones, and so on, and if you look at the cortisol levels, the monkeys who are subordinate, therefore are bullied, will have high cortisol levels, abnormal female hormone levels, and anovulatory abnormal menstruation patterns, compared to the dominant monkeys who are not stressed. But if you switch the groups around so that dominant monkeys now become bullied, and previously subordinate ones become at the top of the totem pole, the hormonal levels change within a month. Cortisol levels in the newly dominant monkeys go down, and their menstruations become normal, and vice versa. So for the researchers to say that hormones have a lot to do with it, but stress is nothing, they don't understand the simple relationship between hormones and stress. And cortisol, it's the stress hormone. How can you say that it's got nothing to do with stress? You know, I mean, it's absurd. If you look at the histories of men with testicular cancer, you find childhood trauma, as in Lance Armstrong. That guy's a traumatized person. Hence his drive to succeed, his need to validate himself, his need to be at the top, because he was an abused child whose mother was 17 or 18-year-old when she had him. The father abandoned him. Then she marries an abusive guy called Armstrong who beats the hell out of the kid. And Armstrong has been compensating for that all his life. including with hormones, by the way.
Yeah.
And if you talk to women with breast cancer, in their lives, there's always childhood emotional loss, significant emotional loss, for which they compensate by suppressing themselves, by not saying no until the body says no for them. And I've had hundreds of women tell me that. You know, once they've read that chapter in my book, they just recognize themselves, and they're grateful to do so. Some say, you blame me for my disease. Again, I say, I'm not, because you're not doing this deliberately. These are your adaptive patterns that you applied without any conscious choice in the matter at all, as a matter of survival. How can you be blamed for that? On the other hand, if you stop doing it now, that can enhance your health, if you recognize it and are able to break out of it. So, again, the relationship between childhood experience, hormones, stress, and adult illness is very straightforward. And, you know, there's this book now called Dying to Be Me. I don't know if you heard about it. It's a woman who was diagnosed with terminal cancer, has got a week to live, has an out-of-body, near-death experience, recognized that all her life she'd not been herself. She had to nearly die to become herself, dying to be me, and walks out of hospital disease-free 2 weeks later. Spontaneous remission. We have examples of that. I talk about it too. I've known such cases. They're always based on a fundamental, sometimes dramatic, sometimes gradually and painstakingly acquired paradigm shift. I can give the personal example of between my wife and I, if she might not be as available to me as I'd like her to be, whether emotionally or sexually. And I have this deep sense of abandonment, and I react by shutting down and not even looking at her. That's the typical response of a child abandoned by mother. Not looking at the mother and feeling abandoned is how a child responds, because that not looking at her is the adaptation technique. It says, I was so badly hurt that I'm not going to make myself vulnerable again, so I will not permit myself to open again to you the same way as I ever did before. Now, when I was 11 months old, my mother gave me to a total stranger to save my life in the ghetto of Budapest, and I didn't see her. And when I did see her a few weeks later, she told me later, I treated her like a complete stranger. I wouldn't even look at her for several days. Now, 50 years later, the woman on whom I'm relying now for emotional contact, physical contact, says no. The same abandonment and the same physiological response then gets triggered, because the perception of abandonment, which is not even conscious, the memory of it, the emotional memory of it, gets triggered, and my physiological response then is that of a child. Now, if I have a paradigm shift, if I actually get that A, my wife is not abandoning me, B, even if she was, I'm not an infant anymore who's dependent on her, and C, that perception and the emotions and physiological responses are simply a memory, then Ray can say no, and then I'll say, oh, I'm disappointed, and then go on, you know. So it becomes a completely, so in other words, my response in the present is very much just based on what I've worked out about my past and what I've been able to transform. Well, the American public has got a great propensity to fall in love with persona rather than real people. The real Reagan wasn't perceived by most people. What was perceived by was the nice, reassuring persona. That reassuring persona was in fact his response to his father's alcoholism, the impact of which he denied on himself. And that denial was the cardinal feature of his political activity, which is why the establishment loved him, because he denies reality, and the people loved him because he reassured them. Mourning in America. Mourning hell. All kinds of factors clouds were gathering on the horizon. Mourning in America. It's denial. And Oliver, if you might recall, Oliver Sacks in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat tells a very interesting anecdote about Reagan. He's working with aphasiacs. Aphasiacs are people who can't process the intellectual content of language because they have a stroke in that part of the brain, and therefore they focus much more on their gut feelings, on their intuitive capacities. So Sachs, the neurologist and author, walks into this ward of aphasiacs who are watching Reagan, the president, on television, and they're laughing their heads off. Some of them are outraged at Reagan, but most of them are totally amused by him. And Sachs says, what is this all about? Is it that they don't understand Reagan? Or is it that they understand him all too well? And he comes to understand that these people actually saw to the real Reagan and saw the inauthenticity, which most people didn't. Most people bought into the act, and the act was very convincing precisely because Reagan himself believed in it. So he thought it was his persona. But his persona was only a compensation, an adaptation to the terrible emotional trauma of his childhood. Well, one of the things that happens in Alzheimer's first is the shrinkage of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a structure in the brain connected with memory and emotional processing. Cortisol shrinks the hippocampus. And when you're denying reality, you're stressed. When Nancy Reagan gets diagnosed with breast cancer, Reagan does not permit himself any kind of human response. He says, you doctors can handle this, I'm sure. Which is not a sign of his not caring. It's a fact of his complete incapacity to deal with the overwhelming emotions underneath he's experiencing. So he suppresses them. Now that's really stressful. And this is how he experiences his life. So his hippocampus shrinks. Secondly, Alzheimer's represents, in many cases, an autoimmune mechanism where the immune system actually makes antibodies against the brain, they think. And it's an autoinflammation. And again, that's secondary too. When you emotionally suppress yourself, then the body turns against you, your immune system can turn against you as well. So that, if you look at the people who develop Alzheimer's, everybody I interviewed, or whose families I interviewed, I should say, early childhood emotional loss. And lifelong patterns of self-suppression and self-denial. And Reagan is the ultimate denier. He wasn't a great communicator. He was the great denier. Now, in a society that can't stand reality, the denialists are, especially if they do it with charm and utter self-belief, because they become so identified with it, like Reagan did, he becomes a much beloved figure. And then you have this contradiction where these fiscal conservatives who rail about the deficit will not look at the fact that under Reagan the deficit went way up. They're in denial too, because they're in love with the persona. It's like the climate change deniers. You'd have to be immensely stuck in denial to question the validity of climate change or its relationship to human industrial activity. But the real denialists aren't only corporate flacks who do so because they're paid to do so, and there are such people who just lie because that's their job is to lie. So these are the people who deny that cigarette smoke is related to human illness and all that. There's still such people. Or lawyers whose job it is in court to make big bucks defending these companies, So there are such sheer opportunists amongst them who intellectually, were they not financially tied to those interests, would be quite capable of recognizing the truth. But there are some people who, quite without any pecuniary interests whatsoever, are simply in denial of reality because they're so hurt by reality that their adaptation to reality is to deny it. So these are the people that then will vehemently deny climate change. Not because anybody pays them to do so, but because denial is their stance. And denial is their stance because, to go back to our common theme here, denial of reality was their adaptation to their own trauma.